think what really struck me when you put that picture of 9/11 up, the first one, was how much it looks like a work by a photographer called Thomas Roof, and he does exactly this. He takes small-scale digital photographs and expands them. And I think that idea of artists looking at the image in contemporary culture, how it's produced, how it's disseminated, and how it's viewed, is a really big theme in contemporary art at the moment. So I think there's a lot of crossover there. Particularly in terms of news journalism, and a lot of artists are working with what's being called aesthetic journalism. I can think of many artists like Sean Snyder, Thomas Roof, Renzo Martins, who we recently showed at Stills. They're looking at the circulation and production of the image. And I think that there's also been a lot of discussion recently about how the image is used as a tool, as an instrument, for example, by terrorists. Using the image to create a sense of collective trauma. The image becomes a tool in that particular war. And I think that while we might like to first think of the image as a tool, as a sort of mechanism for increasing transparency, thereby increasing the sort of democratic process, like for example the printing press, for example, I think the image is a lot more ambivalent.
Well, it's funny, when I got invited to do this, I panicked a little bit because I don't do image. Academics were very precious about what we do and don't do. Well, I do, Slovenian literature before 1850. So I couldn't possibly comment on something that happened in 1851. But it's really kind of opened my mind to thinking much more about exactly that. I'm currently doing a project about how Russians use or don't use the internet to aggregate political power. And I started out by using, I do a lot about political parties and how they market themselves. And so I looked at all the political party websites and there was nothing. I looked for political blogs, nothing really, a lot of navel-gazing. But they get very passionate about disabled children. And they will form politically around rights of disabled children or trying to get medicine for disabled children. And they use an awful lot of pictures of the children. And in one website, they actually use PDFs of letters the children have written. It's children with Down syndrome, and they're really trying to change attitudes. So they have the Down's children write a biography, a little autobiography, and they put it up on the web. Very touching and moving. And they show a picture of the children. And they're also trying to do a sort of positive image campaign. So they try to show that Down's children can look, normal, which is contentious in its own right. But so it got me thinking about, well, when I'm writing this book, I really should include as much as I can something about image. So it's quite. Oh, good. More to include in the book. Oh, good.
Any questions?
Transnational feminists like Chandra Hunting has argued, in my opinion, very convincingly that one of the problems facing the anti-globalization movement at present, apart from being sexist, is that the privilege blinds us. So, in order to arrive at a moment where it's possible for the West to link up with all these multiple ongoing struggles outside of the West in the so-called global South, we need to somehow get beyond this blinding. Like the richer we get, the less we're able to identify with people who have less. And I think that the image image and words have a crucial role to play in, removing this blindfold that our privilege gives us. And I was just wondering if you
I think image, particularly in terms of uniting women worldwide, is very problematic, particularly because of veils, because of wearing the Muslim headgear. I think, for example, people make quick stereotypical decisions about people based on image. I mean, they've done all these studies about how quickly people, will agree or disagree with someone or like or not like someone based on an image. And I think sometimes the image gets in the way. Where I do think the internet could make a difference is voice. In terms of like short films about, this is my life as a Malawian woman. And sort of forcing people to understand, the huge barriers that people are struggling with, particularly in the South. Basically, people have been really disappointed with the internet's ability to bring people together. And I think it's exactly as you said. I think it's because in the wealthier north, people are just, they're just sort of impervious to this. This doesn't resonate with them. But I think it possibly, I found those films very resonant. And I'm wondering if as we go along, people become more accustomed to seeing the other, to trying something different, to not staying within what we call the walled gardens online, but to look at things. I don't know. I think it's a plus and a minus.
I mean, I just wonder about our sheer exposure to images, because they are absolutely everywhere. And where I was reading Don McCullen's book a little while back, and if you remember the images from the Vietnam War, they were hugely significant politically, individual images. Remember the image of the kids with a napalm? And while there are images from the Iraq War, which were far worse images than that, they don't have anything like the impact they had in the past. I think it's partly because there are so many of them, exposed to so many of them on screens everywhere. And also that in some sense the integrity of the image has been undermined because people know how easy it is to manipulate the image now. Whereas you took it on trust before, and what you saw, even though it was selected by the photographer, you thought this was, capturing reality. But now people, I think, realise it's not capturing, it's highly selective, and it's very often manipulated.
There's two really great books on it. I mean, one is The Myth of Vietnam, I think, what is it called? Which is by Daniel Hallen. And he talks about the fact that we going back to Vietnam, we think it was, that there was relatively free reporting, there were these images, and it sparked social change. And his argument is, no, actually, if you look at it, the images followed divisions within the elites, which allowed people to then voice more dissent, but it really was top-down. So he talks about the myth of the so-called Vietnam syndrome, which is, I think, quite compelling. And I think that's why we remember those few incidents. I mean, the My Lai massacre, which was, if you guys aren't familiar with it, probably actually live a happy life if you didn't know about it, is the U.S. Marines going in and actually rounding up the innocent men, women, and children, or women and children, and shooting them, just executing them. And eventually some people were court-martialed for this, which is fairly amazing. But there was a military photographer there who took pictures. And those pictures, a year later, surfaced in the New York Times. It was a military photographer, which is, I think, once again, quite interesting. So it's a question of, yes, the photos that came out were perhaps more authoritative, but I think a lot of things went on in Vietnam that we'll just never know because it wasn't documented. So the sheer volume of it. There's another book by a guy called Andrew Hoskins who writes about media and memory. And he writes specifically about the picture of the girl who's been napalmed and she rips off her clothes. So she's very young, she's like 10 or 11. She's running down a street kind of like this, and probably most people know the iconic image. And he talks about how it's not so much what was happening at the time the image happened or what the image actually, represented, but what we attached to it. So it became important to us because we vested in it with all our anger and outrage at the innocent being slaughtered. But we could have vested that in a lot of different images. So what comes first, the feeling or the image? Or is it some kind of synergistic relationship where the image becomes the catalyst? And I think that's what's so interesting about those films in a sense. He's not really saying that in the films. In the films he's saying different things. I think he's talking about that thin line between theater and protest. Which I also find in the student protests frustrating. Because I think there's a lot of issues there that the government should be accountable for that they're not. Particularly the slow choking of funding for universities. Is just killing off universities by inadequate funding and very poor management. That's not, I know we're all chuckling because we probably all work for public organizations and are not unfamiliar with the notion of poor management, but it's really quite shocking. I'm not sure I answered that at all.
I think we could also think about the images about the grave there as well. I
Yeah,
don't think
that's
that.
what